This is a magnet with both north and south poles. Now, if I were to place that magnet within a loop of metal with the south pole and north pole so arranged, then lines of magnetic flux would travel through and around in that metal loop. By now we should feature the magnetic circuit of this magneto and point out again the rotating magnet with its two poles in full register about. And of course, as it travels, that allows the magnetic circuit to complete and allow the magnetic flux to travel back and forth. And of course, it comes into contact with that metal ring and establishes the metal ring, which by now I should probably call the pole shoes, which, as you can probably see, are located and comprise this section here through which that magnetic flux travels. The pole shoes themselves really are many layers of metal. I'm not sure you can see that, but they are sandwiched together, and they do that throughout electronics in order to reduce the likelihood of eddy currents interfering with the intended current, in this case the magnetic current, through its circuit here, which, as you can tell, also has to travel through this, and also it too has a laminated metal traveling through it, which permits that flux to travel in both directions. Those lines of magnetic flux would travel just like this. And when we spin that magnet, we move the north pole circular in its travel. We move it from this full register position with flux moving this direction. We move it towards the top and at the same time bring the south pole out of its full register to the neutral position, where there is no line of flux to cross, and we continue in our travel from this south, moving it, spinning it yet another 90 degrees in this direction with the south pole aligned over here on this side. And now the north is moving the flux in the opposite way in this direction in another full register position. In 1884, Robert Bosch traveled from Germany to the United States, where he worked with Sigmund Bergman, a laboratory manager for Thomas Edison. He went back to Stuttgart, Germany, and it wasn't until 1887 that Bosch fielded a request from an engineer who needed a timed delivery of a spark. Of course, the principles that we've just discussed about magnetic flux were involved. With the north pole of this magnet on this side of the metal ring, the south pole over here, flux would travel through this metal ring, through and into the south pole in full register. With the black sine wave representing the magnetic circuit, as we travel, we'll find that the neutral register position and full register position are 90 degrees apart of travel, and they move from no flux to greatest flux. Then wane another 90 degrees to point C, where there is no flux, before it continues another 180 degrees of travel. As it makes that 180 degrees of travel, it goes from 0 at point C to the greatest amount of flux again, yet in the other direction. This alternating flux, then, is represented on the magnetic circuit. With the north pole of this magnet over here and the south pole on this side, we can see that the magnetic flux in full register will travel through this metallic ring in this direction. But on this rotor, as we rotate, the north now moves to the top here, the south on this side. There are no lines of flux in this neutral pole. There's no path for the flux to travel. There's no magnetic flux. And then, of course, it moves one more position, and now the north is on this side and the south over here, causing the flux to travel in full register in the opposite direction. Of course, this is the basis for Robert Bosch's magneto. By itself, this magnetic circuit offers us little other than a sine wave of alternating flux passing through this metallic ring. However, you'll notice this constituent part here, which, if I take out and show you, has part of the metal ring passing through it. That metal ring traveling through this component fields the flux in either direction, draws it through the remaining part of this metallic or metal ring. As you know, we've wrapped this line of flux with a wire, a primary winding. Michael Faraday's 1831 law of induction said that if you pass a wire through magnetic lines of flux, each time you cut through the most flux, then you increase the most amount of current. That as magnetic flux passes in proximity of a wire, we are inducing electric current to travel through this component in this coil, which we've tapped for the primary circuit. This schematic representation of both magnetic and primary circuits has already been discussed in part over here with the magnetic circuit represented by this metal loop and, of course, that magnet that rotates. Over here we can show you the winding that is around this coil, a primary winding in this coil through this or around this metal ring. This section of metal ring has the primary winding wrapped around it, and then of course it is led to either the points, a condenser, or the ignition switch. Here are the points up close. You can see the area where a cam can break contacts. When it does, the connections between the two point areas are opened here. Now, the whole time the ignition switch is open, the electrons in the primary can no longer find ground in this path, and therefore they are sent through the points that are closed to ground. However, the points have a cam they share with the rotating magnet and are opened periodically. When they are opened, the electrons must then find a path to seeming ground through this condenser, where they're stored until the closing of this path again. When the points close, electrons from here go through, as do the new batch of electrons travel through. When the points are closed, the electrons will travel to ground. But when we break the contact, then the points open and the electrons travel to the capacitor, sometimes called the condenser, where they're stored until the points are closed once more. I have not been completely forthcoming. There is a third circuit that needs explanation. We've so far talked about the magnetic and the primary circuits. The third circuit, we'll call the secondary circuit. I've told you about the metal ring, which carries magnetic flux traveling through this coil. The primary windings wound around that magnetic ring that respond to the magnetic flux traveling through the magnetic circuit and cause electric current to go to ground in one manner or another. But I have not been completely revealing of the secondary. Here is that magnetic and the primary windings. In this cutaway, we also see many thousands of fine windings wrapped around the primary windings. Of course, these are the secondary windings. When the magnet in the magnetic circuit rotates through the neutral plane, the flux lines stop flowing in one direction and begin to flow in the other direction. The amount of flux is at its lowest, but the amount of change in flux is at its greatest. That's because the rate of change determines the amount of current. Therefore, the amount of current in the primary is greatest slightly beyond the neutral plane in that magnetic circuit. When that current flows through the primary winding, in the primary, each turn also creates a small magnetic charge. That magnetic charge is out of phase with the magnetic charge in the magnetic circuit. These two magnetic fields interact to form what we call resultant flux, which occurs a few degrees beyond the rotation of this magnet. Now here's the money shot. The combination of magnetic flux and the flux from the primary interact to create resultant flux. And the breaker points are timed to open and stop the flow of primary current right at the point of maximum field stress in the primary. Again, when the points open, the primary winding, the current in the primary winding stops, and the magnetic field around the primary winding crashes. It's right then that the flux from that crashing of the primary winding magnetism cuts across all turns of the secondary windings and induces voltage. One more time. When the magnetic field collapses in the primary, its flux cuts across all the turns in the secondary windings. And that's what induces high voltage in the secondary through Faraday's rules. Also through Faraday's thinking, the amount of the voltage is determined by the size of the wires and the rate at which the field collapses. And that ratio of those fine wires in the secondary winding steps up the amount of voltage. Again, the amount of this voltage introduced in the secondary is determined by the rate at which the field in the primary collapses and by the ratio between the number of turns in the secondary windings and the number of turns in the primary. It also needs to be said that this capacitor is here to soak up electrons when the points open and would otherwise spark. So this provides a supposed route to ground, and the electrons don't spark here but fill in the capacitor until the points close again and becomes a route. Of course, this opening and closing of the points is tied to this cam, which is linked to the rotating of the magnet. Permit me to review the magnetic circuit whose rotating magnet with its poles delivering flux in alternating directions. As this rotates and the field changes polarity, the magnetic flux travels through the pole shoes, through this magnetic ring, alternating through 360 degrees of travel by increasing for 90 degrees, decreasing another 90, and so on as it changes direction. The only use of this flux is for the primary circuit. The primary circuit, with its primary windings tapped to bring current to its other components, a cross-section reveals metal core and primary windings wrapped around it, so that when the magnetic circuit travels with flux, the whole time the primary remains level until the greatest change in flux occurs and the EMF is then greatest in the primary. The points open, and the opening of the points are protected by this capacitor or condenser, which soaks up electrons to prevent sparking. The points are closed. The magnetic circuit begins in its next travel to the greatest point of flux, and then its greatest change in flux once more, with the primary circuit traveling right alongside until this great change in flux and increased EMF in the primary, the points once more opened, protected against sparking by this condenser, and then closed once more, and the cycle continues. The secondary circuit windings respond to the interaction between magnetic circuit flux and primary circuit flux. When the primary circuit opens and that field crashes, it's enough to power these windings with EMF. electrons are traveling through this tab, upon which the rotor sits, and whose carbon brush carries electrons which are distributed through this tab into the cap as it spins into electric ignition wires that carry electricity through the central core electrode. Those electrons ionize the gap and jump to the ground on the base of this, carrying 20,000 volts or so to each cylinder